I need to tell you this story exactly as it unfolded, because even now, part of me can't believe my own parents actually did what they did. 3 years ago, Martin and Claire, my parents, decided that my daughter Emma deserved better than the life I was providing. So they took matters into their own hands in the most devastating way imaginable. Let me give you some context. I'm 32 now, but I was 29 when everything fell apart. My marriage to Sarah had ended when Emma was barely 2. The split happened because Sarah wanted a certain lifestyle, country club memberships, designer everything, keeping up with her sorority sisters, and my income as a warehouse supervisor simply couldn't support those expectations. She reminded me of my inadequacy daily. We'd worked out a custody schedule where Emma stayed with me every other week. It worked well enough until Sarah married Derek about 6 months after our divorce was finalized. Derek sold medical equipment, drove a luxury sedan, and bought them a sprawling house with a 3-car garage. Almost immediately, Sarah began suggesting that Emma needed more consistency, that my modest 1-bedroom apartment wasn't suitable, that perhaps we should reconsider the arrangement. My parents supported Sarah completely. Martin had spent 40 years in industrial management, working his way up from floor supervisor to plant director. Claire had been an elementary school teacher for 3 decades. They measured a person's worth by their job title and the size of their home. When I took the warehouse supervisor position after being laid off from my previous job, they acted like I'd announced a career as a street musician. Every holiday gathering became an interrogation. When was I going to pursue a real career? Why was I settling for manual labor? Had I considered graduate school? They adored Sarah because she came from an established family with old money. When she left me, they essentially took her side. The night it happened was a Thursday in November. I'd picked up an extra shift because the holiday season meant overtime opportunities and I desperately needed the money. Emma was supposed to stay with Martin and Claire that evening since it fell during my custody week and I had to work late. I trusted them completely. That trust, that's what still makes my blood boil when I think about it. I got home around 2 in the morning, exhausted and ready to collapse. The moment I walked into my building, I knew something was wrong. My apartment door stood open. Not forced, just open. Inside Emma's bed was empty. Her overnight bag had vanished. An envelope sat on my kitchen counter with my name written in Claire's distinctive handwriting. The letter was typed. My first clue, this had been carefully planned. It explained they'd taken Emma to Sarah's house, where she belonged. That they couldn't stand by and watch their granddaughter suffer because of my poor life choices. That children need stable homes with 2 parents who can provide properly. The letter called me a pathetic failure living in squalor. It referenced the cockroach problem I'd been battling with my landlord for months. It said, "Real fathers don't force their children to live in poverty while working dead-end jobs with no prospects." I called Sarah immediately. She answered on the first ring. She'd been expecting my call. Emma was asleep, she said. Martin and Claire had explained everything. Her lawyer was already preparing emergency custody modification papers. She said my parents had opened her eyes to how unstable my situation really was, how I was barely holding myself together, how it was only a matter of time before I completely fell apart. Then I called Martin. He answered with unmistakable smugness in his voice. "Look at yourself," he said. 32 years old, barely earning above minimum wage, still renting a 1-bedroom with vermin, still wearing shoes with holes in them because you can't afford replacements. Emma deserves better than a father who can't provide basic necessities. Derek has a real career. He can give her opportunities you never will. He said they'd told Emma I was too busy with work to see her for a while, that I was struggling and needed time to get my life together. Claire got on the line, and she laughed. Actually laughed. She said maybe this would finally motivate me to do something with my life instead of settling for mediocrity. She asked if I'd looked at my apartment lately, if I thought any judge would let a child live in those conditions when she had a perfectly good home with Sarah and Derek. I hung up and sat on my couch for an hour, staring at the wall. Then I opened my laptop and researched everything. Parental kidnapping laws, emergency custody petitions, grandparents' rights, interference with custody arrangements. I read until sunrise. Friday morning, I took a personal day. I went straight to the courthouse, filed a police report, and submitted an emergency motion to enforce my custody order. The family law attorney I consulted told me I had a strong case, but it would require time and money I didn't have. Because Martin and Claire had given Emma to Sarah, technically her other legal guardian, the criminal aspect was complicated. But the custody interference was clear-cut. Sarah filed her modification petition that same day, claiming I was mentally unstable due to financial stress. She requested supervised visitation only. She attached statements from Martin and Claire describing my living conditions, my work schedule, my inability to provide adequate care. They painted me as someone on the edge of a complete breakdown. Here's what I didn't do: panic. I showed up to every court date. I followed my attorney's advice precisely. I stayed calm and professional. I gathered documentation from my landlord about pest control measures. I obtained letters from my employer about my performance and reliability. I collected character references from coworkers and friends. I played everything completely by the book. But here's what Martin and Claire didn't know. I'd been saving money for 3 years before this happened. Living in that modest apartment wasn't because I couldn't afford better. It was because I was putting away every extra dollar. When Sarah first started making noises about custody changes, I knew I'd eventually need resources to fight back. I'd been preparing since the divorce. I just never expected my own parents to be the ones to trigger it. The custody battle lasted 8 months. Sarah had money and Derek's income backing her legal team. I had my savings and an attorney who worked on a sliding scale. Martin and Claire testified against me, told the judge I was unfit, living in poverty, that Emma cried when she had to stay at my apartment. All lies, but they delivered them convincingly. In the end, the judge ruled mostly in my favor. She found no evidence of neglect or unfitness. She called Martin and Claire's actions inappropriate and their testimony biased. She maintained my custody arrangement with minor modifications. Sarah was furious. My parents were shocked. They genuinely believed they'd win because they couldn't imagine a judge siding with someone they considered a failure. After the ruling, Martin and Claire tried to apologize. They showed up at my apartment saying they'd only wanted what was best for Emma, that they'd gotten carried away, that family should forgive family. I told them to leave and blocked their numbers. I haven't spoken to them since. Now here's where it gets interesting. 2 weeks ago, I received a voicemail from Harold, their attorney. He sounded desperate, almost tearful. Martin had suffered a heart attack last month, he said. The medical bills were destroying them. Claire had lost 40 pounds from stress. They were living in their 2008 sedan, getting food from church pantries. They were begging for forgiveness. They'd do anything if I'd just help them. I haven't called him back yet. Let me explain what's actually been happening, because the full picture is important. After the custody battle ended 3 years ago, I didn't just block Martin and Claire and move on. I stayed informed about every aspect of their lives. I knew where they banked, what their retirement accounts looked like, their monthly expenses. I knew all of this because before the kidnapping, I'd actually helped Martin set up his retirement planning when he was transitioning out of his management position. He'd given me access to all his financial documents, made me a secondary on several accounts for emergency purposes. He trusted me completely. Then he betrayed that trust by taking my daughter. So about 6 months after the court ruling, Martin started having issues with his retirement fund distributions. He kept getting notices about irregularities, penalties, for early withdrawals he didn't make, problems requiring hours on the phone with financial institutions to verify his identity. Nothing illegal on my part. I just made sure every piece of paperwork had minor inconsistencies that triggered automatic fraud reviews. Address information changed slightly, so correspondence went to wrong locations. Phone numbers in their systems updated with 1 digit off. Small changes creating massive headaches. I also discovered through family connections that Martin and Claire had refinanced their house about 5 years earlier, taking out significant equity. They'd used me as a reference on that application. When the kidnapping happened, I was furious they'd used my name to secure their financial comfort while calling me a failure. So I started making sure every financial institution understood I no longer verified anything about them that previous. References were made under false pretenses that I had concerns about their financial decision-making. The heart attack is real. Martin had it about 5 weeks ago. The medical bills started piling up, and their insurance had gaps. But here's what Harold's voicemail didn't mention. They're living in their car not just because of medical bills, but because the bank foreclosed on their house after they defaulted on payments. They defaulted because Martin's retirement distributions kept getting held up in fraud investigations that took months to resolve. By the time the money came through, they'd missed too many mortgage payments. I know all this because Claire's sister called me last week. She lives across the country and didn't know anything about what Martin and Claire did 3 years ago. My parents had told everyone in the family that I'd voluntarily given up custody because I couldn't handle being a father. When Claire's sister called asking why I wasn't helping my parents in their time of need, I explained what actually happened. She was shocked. She said she'd had no idea that Martin and Claire had painted me as the villain for years. That conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Claire's sister wanted every detail. She kept saying it didn't make sense, that they weren't the type of people to do something like that. But I walked her through everything. The letter, the court testimony, the lies about Emma crying at my apartment. By the end, she was furious at them. She said she'd been sending them money every month, thinking I was the one who'd abandoned them. Then things got more complicated because Emma started asking questions. She's 7 now, old enough to notice things. About a week ago, during my custody time, she asked why she never sees her grandparents anymore. Sarah had told her they'd moved away, but that didn't make sense because they used to live nearby. I had to figure out how to explain this to a 7-year-old without making her feel responsible for adult problems. I told her that her grandparents made some choices I didn't agree with, that sometimes adults have disagreements that take time to work out, that it had nothing to do with her. She asked if they still loved her. I said of course they did, but that I needed to keep her safe, and sometimes that meant limiting who she spent time with. She seemed satisfied with that answer, but kept bringing up memories of baking with Claire and going to the hardware store with Martin. Sarah called me Tuesday. First time we'd spoken directly in probably 6 months since we handle everything through a custody app now. She said Claire had contacted her, told her about Martin's heart attack and their current situation, asked if Sarah could convince me to help them. Sarah wanted to know if it was true they were living in their car. I told her yes, it was true. She asked what I was going to do about it. I said absolutely nothing. That's when Sarah got into her concerned parent voice. She said that regardless of what happened, Martin and Claire were still Emma's grandparents, that Emma would eventually find out I let them suffer, that I needed to think about what kind of example I was setting. I pointed out that she was perfectly fine with them lying in court 3 years ago. She got quiet. Then she said that was different. That was about Emma's well-being. But I could tell she knew how ridiculous that sounded. The conversation went in circles for 30 minutes. Sarah kept saying I was being vindictive and cruel, that whatever Martin and Claire did didn't justify letting them be homeless and hungry. I kept saying they made their choices and were living with the consequences. She finally said Derek thought I should be the bigger person. That made me laugh because Derek had sat in that courtroom 3 years ago nodding along while Martin called me mentally unstable. Harold called again yesterday, even more desperate than before. He said Martin was having complications from the heart attack, that the stress was making recovery nearly impossible, that Claire was falling apart. He said they'd do anything, sign anything, agree to any terms. They'd publicly apologize, admit they were wrong, tell everyone what really happened. I could have whatever money they had left, which according to Harold was basically nothing. I still haven't called him back, but here's what nobody knows yet. I've been working on something for 3 years that's about to come together. When Martin testified in court, he didn't just lie about me being neglectful. He made specific claims about my finances, my work history, my living conditions. Some of those claims were defamatory under state law. I've been consulting with a different attorney about a civil case for intentional infliction of emotional distress and defamation. The statute of limitations is about to expire, but I have everything ready to file. If I file that lawsuit, Martin and Claire won't just be homeless and broke. They'll be fighting a legal battle they can't afford, defending statements they made under oath that I can prove were lies. The court transcripts are public record. The evidence is all there. And even if they don't have money now, judgments can follow people for years, garnish whatever income they manage to get, attach to any assets they might inherit or acquire. Part of me wants to file the papers and watch everything play out. Another part keeps thinking about Emma asking about her grandparents, about whether I want her to grow up knowing I could have helped them and chose not to. But then I remember sitting in my apartment at 2 in the morning, reading that letter calling me a pathetic failure. Remember Claire laughing while telling me I lived in filth. Remember Martin sneering about my worn-out shoes. Sarah texted this morning saying Emma asked her why Daddy won't help Grandma and Grandpa. She said she didn't know how to answer that question, that maybe I should think about what I want to tell Emma someday when she's old, enough to understand everything. Have until next Friday to decide whether to file the lawsuit. Harold has called twice more today. Update 2. For everyone who said Martin and Claire would eventually show up in person, you were right. It happened yesterday, and it was worse than I could have imagined. Though honestly, I'd been preparing for this exact scenario for 3 years. I work at a distribution warehouse now. Got promoted to operations manager about 18 months ago. Better pay, better hours, actual office instead of just being on the floor all day. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with our regional supervisor going over quarterly projections when our receptionist knocked and said I had visitors claiming it was a family emergency. Knew immediately who it was. Martin and Claire were sitting in the lobby looking exactly like you'd expect people living in their car to look. Martin had lost probably 30 pounds wearing clothes that hung loose on his frame. Claire's hair was gray and uncombed, her posture defeated. 3 years ago, that might have made me feel something. Now it just made me angry because they'd done this to themselves. They stood when they saw me. Claire started crying immediately. Martin spoke first, said they needed to talk, that they'd been trying to reach me through Harold, but I wasn't responding, that they were desperate. I told them I was at work and they needed to leave. Claire grabbed my arm. Please, just 5 minutes. They'd driven here using gas money from the church and couldn't afford to come back. Martin said they'd do anything, sign anything. They were begging me to help them. I pulled my arm away and told them they had 2 minutes and we could talk in the parking lot, not in my workplace. We went outside, and that's when Martin's whole demeanor changed. He got this look I recognized from childhood, the one he used when he was about to lecture me about not living up to expectations. He said they'd given me 2 minutes, so I needed to listen carefully. Then he laid it all out. They knew I'd been interfering with their finances for years. They'd finally figured out the address changes and phone number inconsistencies were all me. They had proof I'd been causing all their problems with the retirement accounts, and they could take me to court for it. If I didn't help them right now, they'd file a complaint and I'd lose my job, lose my custody of Emma, lose everything I'd built, just like they'd lost everything. I actually laughed. Told Martin he was welcome to file whatever complaints he wanted, but he should probably talk to a lawyer first about whether he had any actual case. Pointed out that having secondary access to accounts didn't mean I'd done anything illegal, that proving I'd caused their problems would require evidence they didn't have. That's when Claire started screaming at me right there in the parking lot. Called me a vindictive monster who'd been torturing them for years. They'd made one mistake 3 years ago and I was making them pay forever. What kind of person lets their own parents live in a car and starve? Martin's heart attack was my fault. The stress I'd caused triggered it. If he died, it would be on my conscience forever. I waited until she finished, then told them both exactly what I thought. They didn't make one mistake. They made dozens of calculated choices. They chose to take Emma without permission. They chose to write that letter calling me a failure. They chose to testify in court that I was mentally unstable. They chose to lie about Emma crying at my apartment. They chose to tell the entire family I'd voluntarily given up custody. Every single thing that happened to them was a direct result of choices they made. Not anything I did to them. Martin tried the guilt angle next. Regardless of what happened between us, didn't I care about Emma losing her grandparents? Didn't I want her to have those relationships? I reminded him that he'd destroyed that relationship himself when he kidnapped her to prove a point about my inadequacy as a father. That Emma asked about them sometimes and I had to explain why she couldn't see them. And that conversation was harder than anything I'd ever had to do as a parent. Claire said they'd tell Emma everything when she got older. Tell her I had the power to help them and chose not to. That I let them suffer out of spite. Emma would hate me for it eventually. I told her to go ahead and try. Emma would also learn about the letter they wrote, the lies they told in court, the way they laughed at me while explaining I wasn't good enough for my own daughter. The argument went on for probably 20 minutes right there in the parking lot. Other employees were definitely hearing parts of it. Martin kept trying different approaches, threatening legal action, guilt about family obligations, warnings about karma, promises they'd changed. Claire oscillated between crying and yelling. I stayed completely calm the entire time because I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head hundreds of times over 3 years. Finally, I told them I had to get back to work and they needed to leave the property. Martin said if I walked away right now, they'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. They'd tell Sarah, they'd tell Emma's school, they'd tell anyone who would listen that I was an abuser who tortured elderly people for revenge, I told him. Nobody would believe them because they'd already proven themselves to be liars. Then I walked back. Inside, my regional supervisor had apparently heard some of the argument from the window. He called me into his office and asked if everything was okay. I had to explain the whole situation, the custody battle, the kidnapping, everything. He was actually pretty understanding. Said family situations can get complicated, and as long as it didn't become a regular workplace disruption, he wasn't concerned. But I could tell he was uncomfortable. That same night, Sarah called me furious. Martin and Claire had gone straight from my work to her house. Told her and Derek that I'd threatened them, that I'd been sabotaging their finances for years, that I'd laughed in their faces about their suffering. Sarah wanted to know if any of it was true. I told her some of it was accurate, but not the way they'd presented it. She demanded details. I gave them to her. Told her about using my access to their accounts to create complications, about making sure financial institutions questioned their transactions, about systematically making their lives difficult. Sarah said I'd gone too far, that what I was doing was cruel and vindictive, that Martin and Claire had already paid enough for their mistakes. I asked her when exactly they'd paid enough, since from my perspective they'd gotten away with kidnapping my daughter and lying in court with no real consequences until recently. She said they'd lost their house, their health, their dignity. I said, good, that's exactly what I've been working toward for 3 years. The conversation with Sarah lasted over an hour. She kept trying to make me see reason, saying revenge wasn't going to make me feel better, that Emma was going to grow up watching me be cruel to her grandparents and learn that holding grudges was acceptable. I told her Emma was going to grow up learning that actions have consequences and that people who betray your trust don't get unlimited second chances just because they're family. Derek got on the phone at some point. His approach was basically that as Emma's stepfather, he had concerns about the environment I was creating. Teaching Emma to cut off family members who make mistakes would damage her ability to maintain healthy relationships as an adult. Pointed out that Derek had sat in that courtroom, nodding along while my parents called me mentally unstable, so his opinion on healthy relationships didn't carry much weight. Then Sarah dropped something I wasn't expecting. She said Martin and Claire had filed a grandparents' rights petition that afternoon, claiming I was alienating them from Emma without justification. They'd gotten some legal aid attorney to take the case, arguing that 3 years was long enough punishment, that Emma deserved to know her grandparents, that my refusal to allow contact was harmful to her development. I asked Sarah if she was supporting this petition. She got defensive, said she wasn't taking sides, but did think Emma should have the opportunity to know her grandparents if they'd truly learned from their mistakes. I told her that was taking sides, supporting. Their legal action against me was literally choosing their version of events over mine. She said it wasn't that simple. I said yes. It actually was exactly that simple. After I hung up, I spent the rest of the evening researching grandparents' rights laws. They're complicated and vary by state, but generally grandparents can petition for visitation if they can prove it's in the child's best interest. The fact that Martin and Claire had an established relationship with Emma before I cut contact worked in their favor. The fact that they'd literally kidnapped her 3 years ago worked against them. It could go either way depending on the judge. I called my attorney this morning and told him about the petition. He said he'd been expecting something like this. Desperate people make desperate moves. He asked if I wanted to proceed with filing the defamation lawsuit or wait to see how the grandparents' rights case played out. I told him to file the defamation suit today. Here's why. Martin and Claire think they can keep pushing, keep finding new angles to force me into helping them. The grandparents' rights petition is just another manipulation tactic. Another way to threaten me with losing access to Emma if I don't comply. But what they don't understand is that every legal action they take creates more documentation of their behavior, more evidence of their manipulation, more proof they haven't learned anything. The defamation lawsuit focuses specifically on Martin's testimony in the custody hearing where he claimed I was neglectful and mentally unstable. All of that testimony is in the court record. All of it was demonstrably false. Pursuing a defamation case while they're simultaneously trying to get court-ordered access to Emma shows exactly how committed I am to keeping them away from her. Harold called me again this afternoon, practically screaming about how I was destroying his clients' lives, how Martin couldn't handle the stress of another lawsuit in his condition, how I was going to have his death on my hands. I told Harold that Martin should have thought about that before filing the grandparents' rights petition, and that if he wanted to drop that case, I'd consider withdrawing the defamation suit. Harold said they couldn't drop it now that it was filed. So now we're in this spiral where they're suing for access to Emma. I'm suing them for defamation, and Sarah is in the middle trying to play mediator while clearly sympathizing with my parents. Emma's school called today. Apparently Claire went there trying to see Emma during recess, and the school had to call security. They wanted to make sure I knew about the incident and confirmed that Martin and Claire weren't authorized to pick up Emma under any circumstances. I filed a restraining order request this afternoon. Court hearing is next week. Final update. The restraining order hearing was last Thursday. Martin and Claire showed up with their legal aid attorney who looked fresh out of law school. My attorney had 3 years of documented harassment, the kidnapping incident, the false court testimony, and the recent workplace confrontation all laid out in detail. The judge granted a temporary restraining order immediately and set a hearing for the permanent order in 2 weeks. What made it even better was that during the hearing, Martin tried to argue that he needed access to me because I was the only family he had left who could help with his medical bills. The judge actually stopped him and said that wasn't what restraining orders were for. That financial dependence on someone didn't give him the right to harass them. Martin started getting agitated, raising his voice about how ungrateful I was, how he'd raised me and sacrificed for me, and now I was abandoning him when he needed me most. The judge warned him once to lower his voice and control himself. Claire started crying and telling the judge I'd been systematically destroying their lives for 3 years, that I'd manipulated their financial accounts and caused all their problems. My attorney immediately objected, pointing out she was making accusations without evidence. The legal aid attorney tried to calm Claire down, but she kept going, saying I was vindictive and cruel and that someone needed to stop me before I completely ruined them. The judge granted the temporary restraining order right there and told Martin and Claire they needed to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, my workplace, and Emma's school. If they violated it even once, they'd be arrested. Martin tried to argue that 500 feet was excessive, but the judge shut him down immediately. After the hearing, I went straight to Emma's school and met with the principal. I showed her the restraining order and explained the situation in detail, not just the recent incident, but the whole history going back 3 years. The principal was shocked because Martin and Claire had apparently been calling the school regularly asking about Emma, saying they were concerned about her well-being. The principal had thought they were just worried grandparents, but now understood it was part of a larger pattern of harassment. The school added Martin and Claire to their banned visitors list and sent a memo to all staff with their photos. They also agreed to notify me immediately if either of them tried to make contact with Emma through any means. The principal said she wished I'd told them about this situation sooner because they take child safety extremely seriously. The grandparents' rights petition hearing happened this past Monday. Their legal aid attorney actually did a decent job arguing that Emma had a relationship with her grandparents before I cut contact, that 3 years of no contact was harmful to her development, that Martin and Claire had learned from their mistakes and deserved a second chance. He brought up Martin's heart attack and their current situation, trying to make them look sympathetic. My attorney destroyed them. He brought up the kidnapping, the letter calling me a failure, the false testimony about neglect, the workplace harassment, the school incident, everything. He pointed out that Martin and Claire hadn't learned anything because they were still trying to manipulate the legal system to force contact with Emma against my wishes. He argued that people who kidnap children don't get to claim grandparents' rights 3 years later when they're desperate for help. The judge asked Martin directly why he thought he deserved access to Emma after what he'd done. Martin gave this whole speech about how he'd made mistakes but was still her grandfather, how Emma needed grandparents in her life, how he and Claire loved her and always had her best interests at heart. He said they'd only taken her to Sarah's house because they genuinely believed I was unfit to care for her, that they'd been trying to protect her. My attorney asked Martin if he still believed I was unfit to care for Emma. Martin hesitated, then said no. He could see now I was doing fine as a father. My attorney asked if that meant his testimony 3 years ago was false. Martin said it wasn't false at the time, that he'd believed it was true based on what he'd observed. My attorney asked what specifically he'd observed that made him think I was unfit. Martin couldn't give a clear answer. He just kept saying I was living in a small apartment and working long hours and struggling financially. The judge denied the petition. She said grandparents' rights exist to maintain beneficial relationships between grandparents and grandchildren, not to reward people who kidnapped their grandchildren and then lied in court about it. She said Martin and Claire had destroyed their own relationship with Emma through their actions and didn't get to use the court system to force their way back into her life. Martin completely lost it in the courtroom. Started yelling that I'd brainwashed everyone against him, that I'd manipulated the system, that this was all revenge for him telling the truth about my inadequacy as a father. The bailiff had to escort him out. Claire just sat there crying while their attorney tried to explain they could appeal. But it probably wouldn't help. Sarah was at that hearing. She'd shown up to testify on Martin and Claire's behalf if needed. Afterward, she cornered me in the parking lot. She said I'd gone too far, that destroying Martin and Claire wasn't going to change what happened 3 years ago, that all I was doing was hurting Emma by depriving her of her grandparents. I told Sarah that Emma was better off without grandparents who thought kidnapping was an acceptable solution to disagreements. Sarah said that was my anger talking, not rational thought. I said no, it was 3 years of planning talking. 3 years of making sure Martin and Claire understood exactly what it felt like to have your life destroyed by people who claimed to love you. Rachel asked what my end game was, what I actually wanted from all this. I told her I wanted Martin and Claire to spend the rest of their lives knowing they destroyed themselves, that every single problem they had was a direct result of their own choices, that I didn't cause their suffering so much as I made sure they couldn't escape the consequences of their actions. She said I sounded like someone who'd let anger consume him. I said good, because that's exactly what I'd been for 3 years, and it had worked out perfectly. She asked if I was proud of myself for making my parents homeless and desperate. I told her I was proud of myself for not breaking down when they tried to destroy me, for building a life despite their sabotage, for protecting Emma from people who would use her as a weapon. Derek showed up at that point and tried to mediate. Said we should all calm down and think about what was best for Emma. I told him what was best for Emma was never having contact with people who thought lying in court was acceptable behavior. He said everyone makes mistakes and sometimes you have to forgive for a child's sake. I said that was easy for him to say since nobody had ever kidnapped his child and called him mentally unstable in a courtroom. The conversation went nowhere. Sarah said she was going to have to reconsider our co-parenting arrangement if I couldn't be reasonable about family matters. I told her to go ahead and file whatever motions she wanted, that I'd been dealing with family court for 3 years and wasn't intimidated by more hearings. She said I was making everything harder than it needed to be. I said, Martin and Claire made it hard when they decided to kidnap my daughter. Everything since then was just consequences playing out. The defamation lawsuit is moving forward. Martin and Claire tried to get it dismissed, arguing that testimony given in court proceedings is privileged and can't be the basis for a defamation suit. My attorney argued that privilege doesn't protect knowingly false statements made with malicious intent. The judge agreed to let it proceed to discovery, which means Martin and Claire now have to produce documents about their finances, their communications about me, everything they said to Sarah and others about my fitness as a parent. Harold called me last week begging me to settle. Said Martin couldn't handle the stress of discovery on top of everything else, that his health was deteriorating rapidly, that Claire was having what looked like a nervous breakdown. They'd agree to any settlement terms I wanted. A public apology, written admission they lied in court, payment of my attorney fees even though they didn't have money, anything. I told Harold there was no settlement. We were going to discovery, then to trial if necessary, and Martin and Claire were going to have to sit in a courtroom. and explain under oath why they lied about me. Being an unfit father, Harold said I was being unreasonable and cruel. Said I'd been called worse by his clients. Claire's sister called me again yesterday. Said Martin had another cardiac event last weekend. Not a full heart attack, but serious enough they kept him in the hospital for observation. He's lost more weight and looks 20 years older than he actually is. Claire is barely functional, spending most days sitting in the sedan at various parking lots, not eating, not talking to anyone. She asked me point blank what it would take for me to forgive them. I told her there was nothing they could do because forgiveness wasn't on the table. She said I was being vindictive, that Martin might actually die from the stress I was putting him under. I told her Martin was dying from the stress of facing consequences for his own actions, not from anything I was doing to him. She said I was going to regret this someday, that I'd look back and realize I let my anger turn me into someone cruel. I told her I'd been called pathetic, a failure, mentally unstable, someone who lived in filth by my own parents. So being called cruel didn't really register as an insult anymore. Emma asked me again last week why she doesn't see her grandparents. She's been asking more frequently, probably because she's picking up on tension from Sarah's house. I sat down with her and explained it as honestly as I could for a 7-year-old. Told her that sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people, and when that happens, there have to be consequences. Her grandparents made choices that hurt me and hurt her, and because of those choices, I had to keep her safe by not letting her see them. She asked if they still loved her. I said I didn't know. People who truly love you don't use you as a weapon against your parents. She asked what that meant. I told her someday when she was older, I'd explain everything in detail. But for now, she needed to trust I was making decisions to protect her. She seemed to accept that, but then asked if I was mad at her grandparents forever. I told her yes, I probably was. She asked if being mad forever was okay. I said sometimes yes, when someone hurts you badly enough and doesn't truly understand what they did wrong. It's okay to stay mad and keep them out of your life. Sarah found out about that conversation because Emma mentioned it at her house. Sarakale.